welcome back to our podcast. My name is Jasmine, and on this episode of No Cap with GCAP, we will be talking to Dr. Porter, who is an atmospheric dynamics and modeling professor here at UCR. So we will be discussing a variety of topics today, ranging from his research based on the Salton Sea. I'm very excited to hear about it. And also we will get a glimpse at some policy ideas that we should consider implementing here on campus today. So keep watching to learn more because it's going to get really interesting. Yay! Without further ado, let's get to the questions. Okay. So, what inspired your transition from comparative literature during your undergraduate years to physics later on? Because it's a pretty big shift.
It's a big jump. Yeah. I don't usually recommend taking that kind of curvy path, but for me, a lot of it had to do with when I was first starting as an undergrad. I think that many can relate to this. Maybe I didn't really have a clear path. I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was kind of interested in a lot of things, but I didn't really feel pulled in any one particular direction. I did know that I wanted to travel, and so I saw language and literature as something that would help me to connect with people and to understand different cultures, different ways of speaking and thinking, and so my goal for that first period was just to kind of just to get out of school, and so trying to minimize how many classes I had to take to get there was a priority, and then I also wanted to travel, and teaching English was one route for somebody who didn't have a lot of money to do that, and so that was kind of my initial priority. While I was traveling and living in Japan for a while, I started getting really interested in how we interact with the environment and with the natural world, and thinking about sustainability, thinking about energy production. And I realized at the time that my degree in comparative literature wasn't really going to get me a part of that conversation. And so I had this kind of fork in the road where it's like I can either kind of find a career on my own and always kind of be an armchair environmental scientist and just kind of watch from the sidelines, or I can go back to school and I can get a degree in the sciences and I can become a part of that conversation. And I decided then that I was like, I'm going to have to take out some loans. I'm going to have to, go back to school, which sounded terrifying and absolutely insane. But I decided that it was important enough to me that I wanted to do it. And so that's how it's funny because I'll sometimes hear from like juniors at UCR who are like, is it too late to switch? And I'm like, let me tell you a story. It's really never too late to change up your path and to pivot, and, as you evolve and as you grow and as you think about what's interesting to you, I think it's always important to kind of listen to that voice and ask yourself what where you want to head, where you want to go.
Exactly. As long as you're doing something that you enjoy.
Exactly.
What class has been your favorite and most rewarding to teach, and why?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I've taught a range of classes from like the big load classes. ENSC 1, we have 400 students. It's right upstairs in the massive auditorium in the round, which is terrifying to teach in for the first time.
Oh my gosh.
I will say that I think my favorite class so far, though, is an upper div where it's climate and weather, and I don't teach it every year, which is why it's a little bit of a treat when I do get a chance to do it. But I call it informally like cloud journaling. We spend a lot of time looking at the sky and looking at clouds and talking about why certain clouds form when they do and where they do and what that means. And I think that weather, back when I was a comp lit student, one of the first kind of just satisfy the science credits classes that I took was a weather class. And I took it because it sounded easy, but it actually, I think, was my initial gateway into thinking about the atmosphere. And I think it's one of those things where we all have a connection to the weather and a connection to rain and wind and sun, but we don't always think about why things happen the way that they do. And I think that for me, pulling back that curtain a little bit and like thinking about, let's take this thing that we all have experience with and let's try and see why it behaves the way that it does. I think it's really fun for me. And it's an opportunity to kind of like mystify and then demystify something that seems very generic and mundane. Yeah.
Is it specifically reserved for environmental science?
Not at all, no. It won't be taught this year, so I'm sorry to bait and switch there, but I will be hoping to teach that next year, so the next academic year. But it's not reserved just for majors, and it's definitely one that I always enjoy.
Can you give an overview of you and your colleagues' article source-specific acute cardiorespiratory effects of ambient coarse particulate matter exposure in California Salton Sea.
Yeah, the title's a mouthful. They often become that. This was a paper that was written by one of my students, Yanning Miao, a grad student who finished up and is now working for the California Air Resources Board, working for CARB. And so she right now, works for the state and looking at air pollution and air pollution impacts and thinking about how it affects people. We've been interested in the Salton Sea for some time. It's an area where a lot of things are happening, where a natural environment is being affected by human activity. Same old story. And it's affecting the natural environment in ways that kind of feed back and affect humans again, right? Yeah. Which again we see all the time. And one of the pollutants that we are interested in is wind-blown dust, which is kind of one of those things where it's kind of natural, but it can also have unnatural impacts. When the wind blows, it kicks up dust. And when people breathe that, it's not great, right? It's not great to have things in your lungs that's not clean air, right? And in general, the big stuff that's blown around from windstorms is usually assumed to be a nuisance and to be an irritant, but maybe not as impactful on your health as smaller particles that say come from traffic or from wildfires. What we are interested here, though, is that there's been a long time concern that the dust that's being emitted from around the Salton Sea is being highly impacted by what's flowing into the Salton Sea, which is agricultural runoff. So fields get irrigated, they bring salts, they bring fertilizers, they bring pesticides, and it all kind of in the Imperial Valley dumps into the Salton Sea. And so one of the concerns has been, what's that doing as the Salton Sea shrinks? And we have particles that are left behind that then get be lifted up by the wind. And that's a really hard question to tackle, it turns out. What Yanning did was take all of the measurements of dust up and down the valley, and she then ran some models to look at where the air was coming from when that observation was made. So if there's a lot of dust that's measured at this time, she asked the question, where was it coming from, and what kinds of surfaces was it flying over where that dust could have come from? And that allowed her then to see which observations of dust could have been brought from the Salton Sea, this big shrinking lake, and which might have come from different sources. And so then she used that to ask the question, do we see a difference in hospitalizations when dust arrives from different locations? That's kind of the easy version of the title. Does dust affect health differently when it's arriving from different sources? And what she found was that even though the mechanism, the reason for this is kind of still an open question, she did see a stronger impact on human health in terms of how many people were going to the hospital when this dust was arriving from over the Salton Sea area.
Okay. So excuse me if I word this question
wrong,
fine. But was there a specific area that the wind was coming from that made this occur?
Well, in this case, she was sorting out particles that were measured when the wind was blowing from over the sea. And so that could have been that's picking up particles from around the edge of the sea. Okay. That could have been picking up spray from the water as it's kind of whipping up whitecaps. But what she was finding was that there's a bigger kind of gram per gram, just for one certain amount of dust or particles, it seemed to have a bigger impact on human health when it was arriving from the Salton Sea. So that was the specific area that she was focusing on, Because dust can come from anywhere, right? It can come from a road, it can come from a desert surface. And what she was finding that of all the different categories of surfaces, it was most impactful when it was coming from over the Salton Sea. And that was kind of leaving an open question about, well, why is that? What's the mechanism that is driving these particles to arrive? And why are they affecting humans more than dust that's coming from the desert? So questions are definitely being tackled from different directions.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. That's good to know. In your lab Porter group, you present the issue of air quality in correlation with human health through your research on the Salton Sea. So can you tell us more about how people living in coastal areas should prevent being impacted by poor air quality?
Yeah, by coastal, do you mean like near the ocean? Okay. So another project that I'm working on has been, coasts are really unique environments, right? It's an edge. It's where you have, not to say the obvious, but there's water on one side and land on the other. Atmospherically, that makes for some really interesting dynamics and movements. Air will tend to kind of move back and forth depending on which is warmer, and because land and water warm and cool at different speeds. And so that causes these kinds of like breezes from the ocean or breezes from the land alternating over the course of the day, which makes for some interesting things for air quality, where you can have pollutants that will be kind of also pushed back and forth across that coastal boundary. There's also unique emissions that come from marine waters, emissions of gases and particles. The waves are kind of a source of particles. If there's houses along the coast, you'll get buildups of salt that's coming from that sea spray that's kicked up from the surf. And also we get areas like one of the areas that I've been studying around San Diego in the Imperial Beach area, where estuaries or of rivers flowing into the ocean will bring their own contaminants and pollutants. And so they also can be impactful, and especially when they then move into the waves, where it's basically like it's then turning those all into particles, you can get some really unique combinations of natural and human sources of pollution. And so some of my work has been looking at how that is affecting communities around that Tijuana River estuary, including Imperial Beach, including San Diego, those other communities around there. And one of the factors there has been contaminants going basically into the river, so pollution going into the river that then translates into pollution in the air. And so that's been something that's been really tough. And it's really difficult to kind of recommend changes when the ultimate change is pollution that's happening from people upriver, and so oftentimes communities can feel helpless when we can't always control what is in the air when we walk outside. I will say that I'm a big believer in the importance of indoor air filtration. We've learned over the last 5 years from COVID, from the wildfire kind of proliferation, that cleaning our indoor spaces is something that we can do pretty effectively. And so whether or not your home has like a filtered HVAC system, you can build for not much money. You can build your own personal little DIY filtration box, for example. Some of my work has been looking at those. So you can see videos on YouTube on how to put these boxes together. For $80, you can have filtration for a year or more, depending on how many particles it's cleaning out. And when it comes to our health, like that can be really important. Yeah, and so that could be an investment that can really mean fewer sick days. It can mean waking up more refreshed. It can be better sleep. There's all kinds of benefits of having fewer pollutants in your home.
So you would change that out every year, you said?
It all depends on kind of how many particles it's actually cleaning. We had some participants in a study that we did with these filtration boxes where it was so dusty, it was so filled with particles that we could have changed them out every month. It was picking up so much. So after a month of running, these filters would be almost black. That's not ideal, obviously. The good news is that when it's turning black like that, or when it's getting that kind of coated in dust, that's pollution that's not going into your lungs. So that's a good thing, right? It does mean that replacing those regularly would be more expensive. I think in other environments, depending on how polluted that your area is, I think 6 months to a year is a reasonable swap out time for these boxes.
So it really depends on the area.
It really does depend on the area, yeah.
Okay. Now I took ENSC 2. So one of the debates was about the Salton Sea, actually.
Oh,
it
interesting.
was about whether we believed the Salton Sea would be best or keeping it. And I wanted to know what your take on that would be.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I don't want to get too technical, but it's one of those questions where it raises the issue about what we consider to be natural. And so there are some who would say just like, in this area, it's an artificial lake. It was caused by, a breached dam in 1905, which is true that, this version of the lake was kind of accidental in that way. It's interesting to note, though, that if you go back further in time, if you go back thousands of years, that whole basin had been flooded to even higher levels multiple times. And in fact, over a long period of time, it can be argued that during some stretches spanning hundreds or thousands of years, it was flooded more often than it was dry. So what is natural? Like, what is the natural state? It could be that if we were not controlling things with irrigation, that it would be completely flooded right now. The entire valley would be completely filled. And so I think what's important is to note that this was a natural cycle where it would flood or it would dry up. And now we're in control. Now we have our hand on the steering wheel. And so I think the question is, what's the appropriate way to handle that kind of power, to handle that kind of control? Right now, we have an environment there where it's been heavily influenced by humans, by irrigation. If we were to let it completely dry up, there's a few things that we know would be true. all of the worst contaminants, heavy metals, old pesticides that are no longer legal for use, they're resting down at the bottom of that lake. You let that thing dry up, you're now exposing all of these toxins for potentially a situation that's even worse than it is now. And so I would say that from a human health perspective, and we're talking about communities around there that a lot of which are responsible for growing our wintertime crops for much of the country. These are communities that don't have a ton of power as far as determining their environment. They would be very heavily impacted, and they already are, but this would be something that could be very, very damaging. So I would say that from a human health perspective, from an environmental justice perspective, that would be a worst case scenario. One thing's for sure is that right now, it's not going to dry up because it kind of functions as a wastewater collection sump for all this agriculture, right? It is crazy. But right now, the reason it's not drying up is because we are growing crops in the Imperial Valley, and growing crops in the middle of a desert requires a ton of water. And so a lot of that water has to go somewhere, and it happens to go into the Salton Sea. So realistically, it's not going to dry up, but it is going to shrink. And that shrinkage has its own environmental problems and human health problems.
What do you think would happen, let's say, 20 years from now?
If we have like a status quo, it's going to continue to shrink until the reduced level of water flowing in has balanced itself out with evaporation. And so we know pretty well what that's going to look like. What we don't know pretty well is what that's going to mean for natural systems. So the biome of the Salton Sea itself, what that's going to mean for the bacteria and algal blooms that will sometimes crop up. What that's going to mean for emissions from the water and from the sediments around the shrinking lake. These are all open questions that we're working on to try and answer so that we can make the best policy decision. It's one of those tough cases where we don't have an easy, perfect solution.
I guess based on that, what, if any, challenges that you've encountered during your research? I guess other than besides the complexity of finding a solution.
Nowadays, getting money, getting funding to do research. Of course, my team is built on helping students, and helping students means making sure that they're not worried about their tuition or about their paychecks. So for me, as a leader of a group, like one of my big challenges is making sure that I keep my group funded. Certainly, across the board, that's a stress for everybody, I think.
What would you say are good steps for students to take action in mitigating air pollution issues?
Yeah, I think in terms of just for our own, air quality is tough because so much of it is determined by forces that's outside of our control, right? We can't control whether there's a wildfire burning upwind. We can't control how many cars are driving up and down the freeway. What we can control is where we are. So, for example, not necessarily going outside on high smog days. So staying informed and staying aware. Knowledge is power, and being aware of what the air pollution is like outside on any given day maybe can tell you that today's not the right day for an afternoon jog. Or maybe it is a day that you want to try and study and stay inside as much as possible. Keeping and being aware of the air pollution in your home and kind of taking steps to control that is a big one. I think in most of our lives as students, as professors, we spend a ton of time indoors. And so it's easy to lose sight of like how much of what we're doing here, in indoor space, can affect what's going into our lungs and going into our bodies. And so being aware of that, taking steps to control that, taking steps to kind of make decisions about your personal habits, including things like smoking or vaping, can be really big for in terms of just our overall health and specifically for our lungs. And then taking measures to try and reduce when there are problems. If you have a small apartment that doesn't have good ventilation or good kind of existing filtration, finding ways to cheaply control that. That's something where you can really reduce your exposure to pollutants. Again, just by educating yourself, informing yourself, and maybe finding ways to control what's in your home, which is something that you can control, as opposed to what's outside.
That's good advice. How would someone who isn't aware of the environment, what sources would you recommend that they go to be more informed?
About air quality?
Yeah,
nowadays we definitely have a ton of great resources that even 10, 15 years ago were not as common. Most weather apps on your phone will have either built in or have an option to get data about local air quality. There's a lot of different alert systems, especially for things like wildfires, where you can set up alerts or you can have on a handy app to check. And it's one of those things that, if it's just on your weather app and you're just checking it in the morning, it's something that you can just see like, it's expected to be a real clean. Nowadays, with actually the precipitation, it's some of the cleanest air quality that we'll have all year, which is nice. So it's especially the few days after the rain, we have a period before it builds up again when it's very clean and clear. And you'll see that in your app. You'll see that on the online resources. Any site or app that handles that, I think, is a great thing to have, which many of us have already. So that's a great way to stay informed.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Last question is, do you have any other comments on policy suggestions for this campus or more research that you have been thinking of starting?
Boy, so other suggestions. I mean, there's a lot of different things that I'm interested in starting and a lot of different topics. I will mention that a lot of my group is very interested in a question that I think is relevant to a lot of folks who live around here, which is just the proliferation of warehouses around the Inland Empire.
Right.
Folks who have spent a lot of time here know that we've seen this huge growth in warehousing, which of course brings changes in traffic, brings changes in trucks and truck emissions, and so that's been something that's been a question about how much that's impacting our local communities, even around Riverside, around the IE, and so that's, I think, a really interesting question also that's very local and very, very unique to us. One other piece of advice that I would just leave on for students who are interested in this in general is to take advantage of all the opportunities as a UCR student, as a part of the UC network of campuses. We have so many opportunities to get involved through clubs, through internships, fellowships. There's many, many opportunities out there if you're searching around. And you can get started today. You can get started in getting involved in a science to policy group. You can start taking classes to educate yourself about some of these issues and how we can make a difference. And so I think the biggest one is just to never underestimate your ability to get involved, whether or not you have a background in the past in that area. It's never too late to make a pivot, to decide that you want to go from comparative literature to atmospheric physics. You always can make those changes and find the people that are doing the things that you want to do and make yourself a part of it.
That's perfectly said. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Talking to you.
Good to talk with you too. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to today's podcast with Dr. Porter, and a special thanks to Professor Porter for coming out to talk with us today. So we'll catch you guys next time on No Cap with GCAP. Make sure you guys are staying sustainable and subscribe to us to engage with our content. Bye!